Welcome back to A People's Guide to Publishing. I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing and Distribution. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 25 years.
I'm Ellie Blue. I'm the editorial and marketing director here at Microcosm. We are an independent mid-list publisher based in Portland, Oregon. We have 14 employees, over 650 titles in print with 20 to 40 new books per year, and we distribute thousands of titles from other publishers.
We started this podcast so that we can share what we've learned with newer publishers so that you can learn from our mistakes.
Or maybe you just want to understand the publishing industry.
This week, we are going to answer a shockingly common or unshockingly common reader question. How do I pitch my manuscript? Which is truly the question on everyone's mind who writes books.
Yeah, so what form does this question come in? I guess that's not really the question.
They're a writer.
I guess, yeah, people
Spoiler
write
alert.
to us all the time and they're like, how do I pitch my manuscript to you?
Well, I mean, and I don't think that is the veiled question in this case. I think it's actually I watched your episode about how to get published. I watched your episodes about all these other things, and it gave me a lot to think about. And I had an author the other day that was I was helping them with their contract with it for a different publisher. I was being sort of a pseudo agent, and all these things. They were like, well, if I'm not happy with this one, can I pitch it elsewhere? How do I do that? And it was a little bit of a, you just realize how confusing our industry is for often very little reason.
Right. So how do you pitch a manuscript?
So you want to take 16 steps back, not 17, not 15, and then say, why does anybody care about this thing?
What kind of answers might you get from that?
Why, so if you wrote a novel about historical Italy in the summertime in the 1700s, you would say, okay, people in Italy are probably nostalgic people in Italy would benefit from understanding a former era that their relatives lived through in a way that they don't, because this information is not widely available. Or maybe
it's a romance.
Right. Yeah. If it's a romance, they might help them, get excited in a new way and maybe in an old way. And, it's if you wrote a seafood cookbook, then, it's people that want new recipes for that would benefit because they would have that made available to them. And a lot of this goes back a few more steps to say, obviously we know that you, a diehard devourer of this pod, have researched other books in print in your subject area and have looked at them and made sure yours is not redundant to them, because the world does not need the 500th book about kombucha, even if that kombucha is organic, because there's too many books. There's no
kombucha authors.
Point of entry to say, unless you're a celebrity, in which case, please feel free to write your organic kombucha recipes book. But otherwise, find something else that's not horribly overcrowded, and so, this is why people are always well, yes, but my book is a memoir, so it is my story, and that is the value. And I'm well, what's the value to the reader, though?
Yeah.
And this is really going to help you, because in our own pitches, they're almost always too long, horribly unfocused. They tell you everything you don't need to know for 3 paragraphs before burying the lead, which is here is why anybody would care about this book. Or they tell you about themselves forever, which if you were hiring them or maybe selling them, then those would be relevant data points. But you have to sell the book without the author standing there most of the time. So the person isn't the commodity. They're a very tertiary commodity.
So your manuscript that you wrote, you have to figure out, like, what is the value to the reader and kind of be able to say that in one sentence.
5 seconds, ideally, or less. And I have consistently been shocked with what people believe they could say in 5 seconds. Yeah. And so once, and that's the same way that you would pitch your book when it's like when you're writing it, ideally, if it's already written, it's not too late. You just have to like go back and do this developmental stage. When you're selling it to a publisher after it's in print, when you're talking about your book in interviews, it doesn't really change. The being able to pitch your book is being able to pitch your book. It's the same way that your publisher would pitch your book. And the question I get all the time is like, isn't this the publisher's job? And you're like, well, it is after they care, but that you have to break through the noise to make them care. And I've said this before, I'll say it a few more times. Publishers want to publish your book. There is a very confusing misconception that publishers find any excuse not to publish a book, when in all of my experience the opposite is true.
Yeah, we're looking for books that we can sell and get
every
in front
day.
Of readers.
We review pitches, not for the purpose of refusing the pitches, but for the purpose of finding acceptable pitches.
Right. We want books we can publish, and you have to tell us why. And if you can't tell us why we should publish your book, like, that is a warning sign, even if we can see merit in your pitch, because we need you to be out there selling your book once it's published.
Yeah.
Like, we need you at least to be able to tell your friends and family something other than, well, I guess I wrote this thing, it's not very good.
Right. And like, obviously you're going to have feelings, and you're going to have like misgivings and uncertainty and all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, you also need to know why anybody will care, even though like imposter syndrome and publishing a book are like,
they go hand in hand.
Yeah, they're like a little bit of a painful yin yang, but they, understandable. I'm not going to disagree with you there. However, it's like you have to not focus on that in the moment when you're pitching. And I get it. When I've written the book, I have serious imposter syndrome about the book. When it's somebody else's book that we published, I can talk about it all day long because it's fascinating, and I don't have the sort of like emotional weight of that book in the same way. I mean, I do if I'm the editor, but
yeah. I mean, honestly, I find it helpful to like listen to how other smart people describe my book, and then I like steal their phrasing.
Yeah.
Because like it's really hard to see your own work clearly and represent it succinctly.
Exactly. And people will, and there's a lot of popular misconception that you have to say it's like Twilight meets Harry Potter or whatever. And so a lot of people like really just glob onto two popular franchises in this way, or they'll have like a sort of a classic meets something like a contemporary bestseller, but that doesn't really help because it doesn't actually tell you what the book is about. And it doesn't, and like that might be helpful in the sake of like, these are touchstones that I would like to be associated with my book. It doesn't actually tell you what aspect of those books is happening here, And so you don't want to summarize the plot. You want to say something more. You really want to jump all the way to what is somebody getting out of this, and whether that's like an escapist fantasy that like helps me to like re-understand love. Like that would be a great, I just made that up. That would be a great pitch if you wrote a book that could describe.
I mean, you want your book to sound awesome. Like, yeah. Like, and not awesome like to some publisher you don't know. Like, you want it to sound awesome to you. You want it to be the kind of book that if somebody was like, my book is about queer werewolves fighting against capitalism.
Oh, that sounds like an interesting book.
Just to name one very real example, that you would be like, that is the coolest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, obviously the concept needs to like, the book needs to live up to the pitch, but like,
It needs to actually be about what you say it's about also.
But if you can phrase it in a way that's like, where you're like, that is so awesome, that is something I would devote years of my life to creating, that is something I would pick up and read in an instant, like that, it will stand you in good stead, and that excitement will communicate itself as well, and be somewhat contagious both to the publisher and to readers.
Yeah, and so you don't want to, people always want to write their pitch in the style of the book to give the flavor of what it's like to read them as an editor. But that isn't helpful either, because it tends to get lost what you're trying to communicate, I mean, unless you're... No, I can't even really. I don't want to give you an example where that makes sense, because it almost never makes sense.
Imagine someone saying it on the news, like...
Yeah.
And at the top of the hour, we're going to hear about a feminist book about weed farming.
And people are constantly also like, well, if the book is good, won't people just discover it? And then the reality of that is no, there is, 20-some million books in print. So it's essentially impossible to be discovered by circumstance. Like, you are basically only discovered through people being able to easily understand the value proposition of your book and why they care. And, your publisher will have to do this. And your publisher will probably help you workshop this pitch into something a little tidier and more coherent, but in the meantime, you're kind of on your own as you get started, and then having support is only as useful as you're willing to get yourself to the point that you're ready for having support.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub,
on Twitter at Microcosm,
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at Microcosm_pub,
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.